Hopefully you enjoyed your time in the trenches in class. We had our battles. It's always fun to see what tactics you're going to try, see if anyone gets close to capturing the flag. And it also illustrates that this war is kind of pointless, that there's no real way to benefit. Again, using that outdated tactic of taking the territory, well, with all these weapons, you kill your enemy before they can take your territory. So there's not many things that were very effective. We're going to look at some of the specific weapons and why they worked or why they didn't. For the individual soldier, he will have a rifle. Now, rifles are great, but if no man's land is a mile long, you can't reach your enemy. Also, these aren't terribly modern. It's essentially the same guns that were used in the War of 1812. So in that way, not very modern at all. Now, there were some snipers, specialists, but because everyone's underground, you can't use it that often. So here we see some soldiers trying to gauge where the sniper is. And the individual soldier isn't all that effective, especially if no man's land is greater than, a couple dozen yards. Also means that your bayonet isn't all that effective. Your bayonet would only be used in hand-to-hand combat. You can see a little bit on the left-hand side, these little areas of thickness. That's a hole where it will connect to the end of your rifle. I mean, to use your bayonet, you'd have to make it over the top of the trench, make it across no man's land, and get into your enemy's trench. And also, there are plenty of problems with using a bayonet. If it's dull, if I've never stabbed anyone, but I would assume that when you do stab one, it's not like Play-Doh. It's not like slicing into a cake. There's organs and bones and plenty of other issues in killing someone and then retrieving it. And then also the psychological aspect of you need to be a couple feet away from someone if you're going to use this weapon. Then we have the machine gun. We saw the Maxim gun earlier. This is even more advanced. The Maxim gun was usually hand cranked. Now this machine gun is propelled by that ricocheting action. So when the gun ricochets, that pulls the next bullet into the chamber. One problem, however, is it does take a few people to operate. You need one person strictly on the bullets to make sure everything's running smoothly. You need one person directing the location. You need at least a couple people cooling it off, making sure everything's in the right place. It's incredibly effective. It is worth 80 single rifles, but you can't move it. You can't really put it on wheels. You're not going to get it across no man's land because it's so bumpy. So it really only can be used for defensive purposes. So maybe you could try using a grenade. There's a couple ways you could propel it. You could throw it by hand, but no man's land is greater than 100 yards. You're probably not going to get it that far. So maybe you can propel it with a rifle, an RPG. Okay, that gets you a little bit further, but still, you can only cover so much space. And then in the types of grenades themselves, you could have a timed fuse. This is sort of like the grenades we think of today where you pull the pin and you throw it. Or there are grenades that will explode on impact. Again, both of these have problems. Let's say you pull the pin and you throw it, but you throw like a girl, it might blow up in your own trench. Or let's say you pull the pin, throw it too early, gets to the other side, and they throw it back. Still not good. Impact bombs, maybe they don't explode on impact, or there's all sorts of problems. As the war goes on and supplies become scarce, soldiers do start to make their own sort of flying bombs. This is like Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. They take tin cans left over from their food, fill it with projectiles, with gunpowder and a fuse, and they're going to do whatever they can to try and defeat their enemy. One very prevalent weapon that we remember from this war is gas attacks. And chemical warfare is not new. It's been available for centuries, but it was rarely used. It was seen as going against the rules of war, sort of this gentlemanly conduct that generals followed. The French were the first to try it, but the Germans perfect it because they do have superior technology. The thing about chemical weapons, especially gas attacks, is in the trenches, you're not taking territory. The individual soldier's rifle is is useless. You are going to try whatever you need to hurt the enemy. So there's different types of gases that are used. First, there's tear gas, still used today. It's just sort of discomforting, but it bothers your eyes, but not really all that damaging. So then there's chlorine gas. Chlorine gas, when it is inhaled, can cause asphyxiation and sort of burns your lungs and kills you from the inside out. Then there is phogene, Phosgene. Phogene gas, it does have a smell, so you can sort of detect it beforehand. Smells like moldy grass, but also you're in the middle of a field, so is it moldy grass or is it this gas attack? Again, similar to chlorine, it would cause asphyxiation, but in the case of phogene, it might take up to 48 hours. So you wouldn't know if you were attacked or not if you didn't smell the gas. And then probably the most damaging would be mustard gas. This not only can damage your lungs, it can essentially boil your lungs, but it will cause these awful blisters on any exposed skin. Might not kill you right away, but you might die from your injuries. Different methods of gas attack. You can have a grenade sort of thing. You can put it into artillery, or you can also just sort of connect it to tanks, and if it's a nice breeze and the wind is in your favor, it can float across to the other side. Another type of weapon are flamethrowers. Not new, just like chemical weapons. If you have some sort of fuel source and you have flame, you can have a flamethrower. First time this was used in World War I is 1915. Again, we're starting to use crazier techniques because trench warfare, we've gotten to that stalemate. We're going to try whatever we can to have something change. You really need to be close to your enemy in order to use this, so that's one setback. And also, it's very dangerous to operate. You're essentially carrying a backpack of gasoline. If you're shot, you are blowing up. And there's a great clip from The Young Indiana Jones, if you want to watch that shows both gas attack and flamethrowers. And this, in 1916, is when we will see tanks, finally. Now, the idea of an armored vehicle is not new. Leonardo da Vinci came up with ideas. They tried them in the 1700s, sort of these protected carriages. But they all failed, and there are two reasons why. One, these new tanks have caterpillar tracks. They can be pulled by tractors. This is important, especially with trenches, because wheels would fall into the trenches, or wheels would get stuck in no man's land. With caterpillar tracks, the tanks will be able to go over the top of the trenches to deal with the inconsistencies in the terrain. Also, they're made with stronger metal, so they can withstand more. And they are self-propelled. Think of our discussion during the Industrial Revolution, where the steam engine starts with needing to be fed by coal all the time. But once we get gas-related fuels that can be self-contained, then they can run on their own. Winston Churchill was really pushing for use of the tanks because he wanted to see some sort of change. Once stalemate sets in, you need to come up with new things. You need to come up with new techniques. And Churchill was very important in getting the tanks used starting in 1916. But then, once the tanks start being used, they create weapons to defend against the tanks, and that's why you have landmines, pressure-triggered bombs that are buried underground. Problem with that is you don't always remember where you buried your landmine, so you could potentially be damaged by your own weapons. And then the most effective weapons of this war were the artillery, the big guns, the big cannons. Now, mortars, they were smaller caliber, maybe a few inches. And caliber refers to the size of the bombs. Then we have the howitzers. Howitzers were even used in the Civil War in America, but now they're being made with stronger materials, more effective bombs. But the biggest and most effective were the Big Berthas, or Grosse Bertha, created by the Germans. And you can see the little ladders here. That's how large they are. Those were ladders for soldiers to climb up and operate Big Bertha. Big Bertha shells were almost 17 inches in diameter, and she had a range of over 7 miles. So this is the type of shelling that could go on for days on end. Now, those shells don't always explode the way they're supposed to, so there are still some left across France. Not everywhere, but scattered here and there. Sometimes they're found by a farmer who's plowing his land, and bomb disposal has to be called in to make sure that they're not live. But this is where Moonscape comes from. So 2 specific battles I want you to know about. The first is Verdun. The Battle of Verdun is the longest battle of the First World War. It lasts for 10 months. Verdun is important. It is located on the Meuse River. It's about 150 miles from Paris. And if the Germans could take Verdun, they would have a straight shot via the river to get to Paris. So it's very important to the French to hold on to Verdun. They had set it up as a garrison town. They had ringed it with forts. But by 1915, most of the fighting was taking place further north, and the French army decides, we need those guns elsewhere, we need those soldiers elsewhere, and Verdun is essentially abandoned. The Germans see this as a great opportunity, and they start attacking. Not only do they want to take the city of Verdun, but they want to just annihilate the French army using attrition. And attrition means, weakening or exhausting your enemy by constantly attacking and abusing them. And one general said he wanted to bleed the French army white. There is a clip over to the right if you want to watch it. We really see the importance of artillery. Over 10 months, both sides combined used 40 million shells. 40 million shells! That's hundreds a day for 10 months. You can look at that and say, oh, isn't that pretty, all those little rolling hills? But that used to be flat beforehand. Before Verdun, the Battle of Verdun, this was flat. The French have to get their butts in gear and defend Verdun, because they know if they don't, the war is over. The Germans will get to Paris, take it over, and everything's done. Even though the Germans retreat, technically the French win. Nobody really wins because of the huge loss of life. 700,000 lost. This war, even though it's about winning the war, no one's really winning. The other battle I want you to know about is called the Somme. This is much closer to the English Channel. This is the same year, July to November of 1916. This offensive had already been in the works before the attack at Verdun happened in February. The British and French were going to work together. They had planned maybe August, September of 1916 to attack here. But they move up the timeline, and the British take the lead at the Somme to allow the French to focus on Verdun and to split German resources. So now, starting in July, the Germans are both concentrating on Verdun and the Somme. The Somme is remembered as having the bloodiest single day of the war. In just the first few hours of July 1st, 60,000 casualties. This is huge. And its proximity to Great Britain, it's just across the channel. Some people even said that in London, you could hear the artillery. You could hear the muffled sounds of the bombs. The Somme is also the first time that the tanks are used. They are able to go over the top of the trenches, navigate the differences in elevation across no man's land, to drive over the barbed wire that the individual soldiers would get stuck on otherwise. And here is an aerial view. This is from a reconnaissance hot air balloon. It is seen as a victory for the Allies. They get 6 miles. Hooray, 6 miles. To us, 6 miles is nothing. But in stalemate, this is pretty significant. The British also prove that not only have they always been a good navy, but they have a great army as well. The Battle of the Somme is also the first real test of Lord Kitchener's volunteer army. Most of the soldiers who had fought up until this point were the already existing British army. So at the Battle of the Somme, you have entire battalions from a single neighborhood, a single town. That also means that sometimes entire towns lose all of their young men. So it's very demoralizing. Also, Germany has reached the point where they're starting to run low on soldiers and they're getting exhausted and they're demoralized. Even though technically this battle is in the win column for the Allies, the huge loss of life causes especially the British to question the direction of the war, to question the leadership of the war. And the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, is asked by the King to step down. And David Lloyd George will take over position as Prime Minister, because he's seen as he'll be able to accomplish more. He will be more likely or more prone to action. They want this war to be over. It's dragging on. The cost is too great, and not enough has been accomplished.